Benjamin Franklin was an unlikely hero. From humble beginnings, he raised himself to a higher standard. He was an inventor, scientist, writer, scholar, postmaster, spy, and revolutionary. He had integrity that could not be matched. The odds were against him rising to any serious station, being of 10 children, poor and with few prospects. He became a postmaster, ambassador, teacher, and student. This man never stopped learning and was generous with his knowledge. At 12, he became an apprentice to his brother in a print shop at the New England Courant, his brother's newspaper in Boston. Franklin wanted nothing more than to write for the New England Courant, but his brother would not allow it. At his young age, it was thought he would not be taken seriously in his writings. He began penning the Silence Do-Good letters at 15 or 16 years old. A boy this young wrote eloquent and thought-provoking letters under the guise of a matronly lady whose preacher husband had passed away. The do-good letters espoused virtue, equality between men and women, and certain states of affairs in the colonies. They caused quite a stir among the readers and helped sell a lot of papers. In 1723, Benjamin and his brother James had a disagreement concerning the direction the paper was taking. They had differing opinions on how the paper should be handled. Benjamin left the paper and Boston to strike out on his own in Philadelphia. Once established in Philadelphia, Benjamin set about making a living. He employed his love of writing and his outstanding wit to produce Poor Richard's Almanac. Here he continued his penchant for pseudonyms by listing the author as Cardanus Ryder. Cardanus Ryder was a pseudonym for Richard Saunders. In essence, his pseudonym had a pseudonym. The almanac had great success, printing 10,000 copies a year. This venture brought great wealth to Franklin. In 1729, Benjamin Franklin and his partner Hugh Meredith bought the Pennsylvania Gazette. They quickly made this paper into the most popular newspaper in the country. They added inserts to the paper, such as Ephraim Saunders' Cyclopedia and Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences. Franklin was an avid learner, but he also enjoyed instructing. He wanted everyone to have easily attainable education. These inserts were part of his desire to impart knowledge on all people. He also wrote many satirical articles, books, and pamphlets. He was a great propagandist who would only give enough information to further his cause. He used his satire to poke fun at the British and the rules they continuously imposed on the colonies. He did this through serious discussion as well as satire. He seemed to write in a multitude of mediums because he was pandering to a multitude of people. He understood that the presentation of an argument in different forms would appeal to different people and mindsets. After the stamp tax was imposed on the people of the colonies, they refused to buy stamps and materials associated with the tax. The large amounts of revenue the empire was expecting from this tax didn't come. Many letters and communications were passed between the colonies and Parliament, but to no avail. Colonists would not submit to this tax. In 1766, Parliament called Benjamin Franklin to testify before them on the matter of the stamp tax. His testimony can be read at lerner.org, and it is quite a testimony. My favorite quote is in regards to the question, "Do you think the people of America would submit to pay the stamp duty?" And Mr. Franklin answered simply, "No, never, unless compelled by force of arms." The Americans were overtaxed in Britain's attempts to wage wars. The empire expected to recuperate the war expenses from the Americans. As Benjamin Franklin pointed out in his testimony, the Americans had already raised, clothed, and paid during the last war many millions. The Americans had already carried the brunt of the most recent war, and to tax them further would be to put the colonies in abject poverty, something that Franklin made clear would not happen without war. Once his testimony was complete, the British rescinded the stamp tax. They could not afford another war. Prior to his testimony in Parliament, Benjamin Franklin had hoped to avoid a war. There was never a good war or a bad peace. While he was not a pacifist, he had hoped that the colonies and Parliament could come to a compromise if Britain would stop overtaxing the colonies and allow them to represent a Parliament and allow them to be represented at Parliament a conflict could have possibly been avoided. The colonists wanted their voices heard on matters that directly affected them. However, the Crown had been in many conflicts in the recent years, and their coffers were low. While in Ireland around the same time period, Franklin saw the abject poverty the Irish were living in and could not bear to see this happen to his beloved colonies. He thought of himself as British American with ties to both countries. He lived and worked part-time in London and felt that the colonies could prosper with British backing. However, he was not blinded to the fact that the British would always live off the backs of the Americans if they were not brought to heel. He worked very hard while in London to convince those in power that it was in the best interest of the Crown to not overtax the colonies, to allow them to prosper and pay fair taxes. Unfortunately, the British did not agree. When the British continued passing down tax resolutions that were sure to break the colonies, he knew the time for compromise was over. When Benjamin Franklin returned to the Americas after giving his testimony before Parliament, he was immediately drafted into the Continental Congress to represent Pennsylvania. In the years following 1766 to 1775, it became apparent that war would not be avoided. The members of the Continental Congress knew they had to send the right message to the American colonies and to the British. Benjamin Franklin suggested that Thomas Jefferson be the author of the Declaration. He knew Jefferson to be an outspoken and eloquent man who would do justice to this most important document. Jefferson, Franklin, John Adams, Robert R. Livingston, and Roger Sherman became the Committee of Five and set about to starting a nation. Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic talents would best be utilized outside of the colonies. He was sent to Paris, France, to ask for their aid. He was there from 1776 to 1778. He was successful in convincing them to help the colonies in their battle to become a free nation. In all actuality, the French did not need a lot of convincing or concessions to come to the colonies' aid. They just needed to be convinced it was a winning battle. The French and English had been at war with each other for the better part of 300 years. Enticing the French to be a part of a war that would hurt British interests was not that difficult after the colonies won the Battle of Saratoga. Benjamin Franklin also used his propagandist abilities to only give the French information that would sway them to his cause. Once good reports of American victories were imparted to them via Benjamin Franklin, the French sent their ships and soldiers to aid in the war. The French people loved Franklin. The women in France even styled their hair to mimic the fur hat he was notorious for wearing while there. His image was everywhere in French society, on snuff boxes, paintings, medallions, rings, etc. He used his charismatic personality to become a part of the high society in France, and he used that charm to persuade the French to his way of seeing things. His popularity in France was a victory in America. Benjamin Franklin was an amazing figure in the 18th century. Before the mass communication systems we have today, he was known worldwide. He used his influence in ways that were most beneficial to the colonies. He wanted to see his fellow citizens prosper and live happily. His integrity was unmatched. Once, while postmaster, he intercepted private letters between Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his lieutenant governor. These letters requested more British troops to suppress colonist uprisings. Franklin passed these letters on to several members of the Sons of Liberty, one of which published them in the Boston Gazette. Hutchinson fled the country afterwards, fearing for his safety, and the British began an investigation into the matter. When 3 innocent men were accused, Franklin stepped forward and admitted his part in the conspiracy. The admission tarnished his reputation in England. He was publicly reprimanded by Parliament and removed as British postmaster. The possibility of him being imprisoned or executed for treason was very high in this situation. For him to step forward and admit his place in the scandal shows the integrity of this man. He very simply could not have stayed quiet and allowed the 3 accused to take the blame. He was not the type of man to allow others to suffer for his actions. There is no doubt this man thought outside the box. His many inventions and experiments have impacted not only America but the world. From eyeglasses to electricity, this man's influence can see everywhere we look. He suggested the first library, hospital, American university. He truly wanted all people to learn and be educated. He had a respect and love for learning and never missed an opportunity to educate and experiment. This man, while he was a behind-the-scenes worker, had the most influence on the early years of the United States. Every person of influence, every colonist with an idea came to Benjamin Franklin for his input. If Franklin was involved, it was a worthwhile venture.